The Nebraska Sandhills, 1899. The year was 1899, and the relentless, wind-scoured expanse of the Nebraska Sandhills served as the stage. While established homesteaders frantically hustled to raise traditional frontier dwellings, either rough-hewn log cabins or thick-walled sod structures, before the killing frosts of October, Ole Jensen, a Norwegian immigrant known for his quiet intensity, was engaged in a bizarre, laborious ritual. It was late September, and he was still meticulously stacking what looked, to every passing eye, like oversized, golden hay bricks. To his neighbors, this deliberate eccentricity was proof enough of either profound poverty or staggering ignorance. They scoffed, labeling his endeavor an act of folly. Jensen's creation was monumental, defined by its absurdity. Walls 2 feet thick, constructed from dense bales of compressed prairie grass, sealed meticulously with a plaster of local clay mud. The conventional wisdom dictated speed. His neighbors had finished their drafty cabins in under 3 weeks. Jensen, however, spent a patient, focused 2 months on what they condescendingly called the haystack house. The community waited, convinced that the first serious gale would simply erase his work. The reckoning arrived on January 21st. The storm manifested as an abrupt, monstrous force, a blizzard that descended from the northern plains without preamble. Winds immediately reached 40 miles per hour, and temperatures plummeted into the lethal zone, 20 degrees below zero. This was the beginning of 7 brutal months, etched into the memory of the territory as the hard winter. Traditional structures failed spectacularly. Log cabins, poorly framed, groaned and sometimes collapsed beneath the impossible weight of snowdrifts. Sod houses, reliant on moisture for stability, leaked profusely, turning their interiors into slick, frozen tombs. Families desperately consumed their entire winter stock of firewood, cords upon cords, yet the cold still seeped through bone. But within that 2-foot-thick hay-bale fortress, the impossible was happening. Children played, moving freely and without coats, while the occupants of conventional homes shivered miserably, sometimes only yards away. What practical, fundamental truth had this solitary Norwegian grasped about insulation, air movement, and basic thermodynamics that the entire collective experience of the American frontier had somehow missed? If you value stories of ingenuity and practical wisdom that survive the ultimate test of nature, please consider subscribing. We document accounts like this, narratives too important to be forgotten. The immediate context for this forgotten wisdom was the geography itself. The Sandhills of Nebraska were a geographical anomaly, an immense, rolling sea of stabilized, grass-covered dunes stretching to the limits of sight, a landscape that had baffled and broken generations of pioneers since the initial westward migrations. This region was fundamentally different from the agricultural Eden settlers envisioned. Unlike the deep, rich black earth of Iowa or the tightly bound prairie sod found further east, the sandy soil here was ephemeral. It crumbled into dust instantly upon touch. Timber was virtually non-existent. The few cottonwoods that managed to cling to creek beds and the scattered willows in low depressions were stunted, twisted, and critically sparse. Settlers quickly realized, often when it was too late, that the established solutions of the frontier, the building techniques passed down through generations, were utterly inapplicable here. Jim Caldwell, a Kentucky-born farmer who had arrived in 1878, embodied this hard-won lesson. He had carried with him the grand, nostalgic blueprints for a robust log cabin, mirroring the structure his grandfather had raised in the Appalachian foothills. But after days spent searching, riding across the barren expanse, he realized he could barely gather enough stunted timber to frame a chicken coop, let alone a habitable dwelling. The few suitable logs were situated near the distant Niobrara River, and the cost of hauling them often exceeded the entire annual cash income of a struggling family. Even the ubiquitous sod houses that anchored settlement on the eastern plains were nearly impossible to construct here. The unstable, sandy soil lacked the robust root structure to produce thick, coherent strips of sod. The weak sections the settlers cut crumbled into heaps of dirt within weeks, defeated by the dry air and wind. Caldwell had once witnessed the appalling sight of a neighbor's hastily constructed sod wall literally disintegrate and blow away during a routine summer thunderstorm, forcing a family of 5 to sleep exposed under a wagon tarp. Yet, the law was absolute. The Homestead Act required proof of improvement, a legitimate dwelling, cultivated acres, evidence of permanent intent. The later Kincaid Act, while doubling the granted acreage in the difficult sandhills, maintained these stringent requirements. Settlers were obligated to build, often relying on expensive, shipped dimensional lumber to cobble together flimsy, thin-walled frame shacks. These structures were notoriously poor, leaking heat faster than a man could even draw his axe to split firewood. Others resorted to carving subterranean dugouts into the sides of hills, dark, damp caves that maintained a constant, clammy chill throughout the winter and invariably flooded with toxic runoff every spring thaw. Into this landscape of failure arrived Ole Jensen in 1887, carrying an idea forged not in tradition, but in pragmatic necessity. The Norwegian immigrant had spent his initial decade in the vast lumber camps of Minnesota, a schooling that taught him the crucial distinction between merely traditional construction and genuinely practical, efficient building. His philosophy, rooted in the harsh forests of his homeland, dictated survival through the resourceful use of immediate resources, ignoring the rigid dictates of ancestral methods. When Jensen surveyed the endless, waving expanse of the sandhills' native prairie grass, some bluestem and switchgrass reaching 8 feet in height, dense as a wheat field in a good harvest, he saw not livestock feed or nuisance brush, but the perfect, abundantly available building material that everyone else was either clearing or baling solely for winter cattle rations. By the 1880s, the mechanical hay baler had dramatically altered prairie agriculture. These steam-powered behemoths could compress masses of loose prairie hay into solid, rectangular blocks weighing between 90 and 100 pounds, bales so tightly packed that driving a nail through them was a struggle. Most homesteaders used these precious blocks strictly for winter feed. Jensen saw them as prefabricated masonry units. Each measured approximately 14 inches wide, 18 inches tall, and 3 feet long, the precise dimensions of massive, easily handled building blocks, yet infinitely lighter and possessing insulation properties far superior to stone or fired brick. Throughout the summer of 1898, Jensen began the construction that would make his name a fixture in Cherry County conversation. He established a solid foundation using readily available native stones, lifting his first course of bales 8 inches off the ground to eliminate capillary moisture damage. The walls ascended slowly and deliberately, each bale placed like a giant, meticulously positioned brick in a running bond pattern, joints staggered to ensure maximum structural integrity. At the base, the walls were an astonishing 24 inches thick, double the depth of the heaviest log cabin wall in the entire territory. The neighbors convened daily to observe this spectacle, shaking their heads in collective disbelief. What earthly good is a haystack for a house? Jim Caldwell scoffed, his voice ringing with derision among the onlookers. The first serious wind will simply scatter it all the way to Kansas. Others were crueler still. The local blacksmith proclaimed it the biggest damn waste of feed hay this county has ever seen. The postmaster's wife, a self-appointed moral authority, declared it an utter embarrassment to decent folk, a clear signal that Jensen is too poor or too shiftless to afford proper materials. Children, fascinated by the strange golden structure, dared one another to throw stones at the walls, wondering whether the missiles would harmlessly bounce off or puncture straight through the fibrous mass. Jensen maintained his silent focus, systematically ignoring the mounting scorn. He carefully notched individual bales, shaping them with a specialized crosscut saw to fit precisely around the door and window frames. He then compressed the entire wall structure, driving long, sturdy wooden pins through multiple courses of bales to bind them into a monolithic unit. The roof, designed for lightness, required minimal structural timber, just enough rafters to support cedar shingles, without the massive, load-bearing beams required for traditional log construction. Where his neighbors needed dozens of expensive timbers, Jensen utilized perhaps a dozen pieces of dimensional lumber, much of it salvaged from discarded packing crates and abandoned wagons. The most unusual step, however, was the final coating, the plastering. Jensen compounded local clay with sand and finely chopped straw, a resilient mixture known locally as gumbo mud. This heavy mixture, applied in thick, unforgiving coats over a chicken wire mesh stapled to the exterior, sealed the entire structure completely against wind, rain, and rodents. From a distance, the finished walls looked deceptively conventional, until one registered their extraordinary, monolithic thickness and the peculiar way they seemed to utterly absorb sound, creating a profound interior silence. Only Reverend Samuel Weaver, the pragmatic Methodist circuit rider who had witnessed everything from Native American earth lodges to Canadian homesteads, offered a defense of Jensen's unorthodox methods. Addressing his skeptical congregation after Sunday services, he stated plainly, "I've wintered in structures you'd call primitive," he told the skeptics. Thickness matters far more than beauty when the thermometer begins its final descent. But the mockery only intensified. As late autumn approached and the Jensen family prepared to settle into their strange new home, the neighbors started making serious wagers on its predicted lifespan. Some gambled it would be reduced to kindling by the first strong nor'easter. Others were convinced that the house would be devoured from within, arguing that the odor of cured grass would attract every rat and mouse in the territory, eating the family out of house and home before Christmas. By late September, Ole Jensen's family was comfortably ensconced, while their neighbors were still desperately rushing to complete their conventional dwellings. Caldwell frantically finished chinking the gaps in his log cabin just as the inaugural frost silvered the prairie grass. The school teacher moved into her brand-new frame house, whose walls were so thin that one could literally push a pencil through the ill-fitting gaps between the boards. The German family down the creek, proud of their seemingly solid earth walls, finally finished their deep dugout. October delivered the first true challenge, a 72-hour storm defined by driving rain that eventually transitioned into heavy sleet. Conventional buildings immediately began to fail, logs shifted, seams leaked, and occupants shivered miserably beneath piles of blankets, stoking their fires continuously through the night. The Jensen home, in contrast, stood utterly silent and solid. There were no frantic lights flickering within, and conspicuously little smoke pouring from the chimney. When cautious neighbors ventured to check on the family's well-being, they were astonished to find the interior space comfortably mild. The thick, earthen-plastered walls had acted as a thermal battery, absorbing the solar warmth of the day and slowly radiating it back through the long, frigid night. Jensen maintained only a minimal token fire. Yet, the skeptics were relentless. They dismissed this early success as mere autumn weather, insisting it proved nothing. The real test, they assured one another, would arrive when the thermometer consistently dropped below zero and the relentless prairie wind howled for weeks without mercy. Only then would they truly see if compressed grass could compete with the proven resilience of log, sod, timber, and stone. By November, the snowfall was already significantly deeper than average, prompting old-timers to predict a truly fearsome season ahead. The omens began to materialize in late November, initially subtle but undeniable to anyone experienced in the prairie's moods. Snow dusted the ground 3 weeks ahead of schedule while cattle were still out grazing. On November 20th, the temperature dropped 15 degrees overnight and stubbornly refused to climb back up for 7 days. Pioneers who remembered the terrible winter of 1857 began anxiously inventorying their dwindling firewood stacks and murmuring about ill tidings. By the first day of December, 18 inches of snow blanketed the ground, more than many years received in the entire season. Even the Niobrara River, which rarely froze completely, displayed ice thick enough to bear a man's weight. Official weather records from the nearest army post would eventually confirm the reality. These were the most severe early winter conditions recorded in 40 years of frontier settlement. But the homesteaders required no official metrics to understand the unprecedented danger they faced. Jim Caldwell's traditional log cabin quickly began to betray its fatal weaknesses. He had adhered strictly to the methods taught by his grandfather, single walls of 8-inch logs chinked with a mixture of mud and moss. He had positioned the stone fireplace against the north wall for optimal draw. In milder Kentucky, this design had served 3 generations. In the ceaseless, arid Nebraska wind, it was a liability. The wind located every minute gap between the logs. Frost began forming on the interior walls 3 feet away from the blazing fireplace, a phenomenon Caldwell had never witnessed. The chinking mixture, made of clay, grass, and horsehair, dried instantly in the frigid prairie air, cracking and crumbling within weeks of the initial freeze. Every tiny gap became a superhighway for frigid air infiltration. Caldwell spent punishing hours each day replastering the worst breaches, yet new fissures opened faster than he could seal them. By mid-December, his family was consuming 4 cords of firewood a month, double their projected consumption, yet they still huddled around the hearth wearing their heavy outdoor coats. The school teacher's frame house fared significantly worse. Constructed quickly from shipped lumber using standard, uninsulated techniques, the walls consisted of nothing more than 2-inch planks. As the lumber contracted violently in the sub-zero temperatures, the slight gaps between boards, invisible during construction, widened into whistling fissures. Wind literally whistled through the structure so fiercely that candle flames flickered wildly from cross breezes. She frantically stuffed rags, old cloth, and newspaper into every visible crack, but the building seemed constitutionally determined to leak heat faster than her small, overworked stove could possibly generate it. Meanwhile, the 3 families relying on dugouts faced a distinct, but equally devastating set of structural failures. The earth walls, meant to provide natural insulation, became treacherous conduits when ground moisture seeped through from above. This underground seepage immediately froze into thick sheets of ice across the interior walls, creating surfaces that radiated brutal cold into the small, confined living spaces. The Schmidt family woke every morning to find their drinking water buckets frozen solid, despite having kept a fire burning aggressively all night. Their youngest daughter developed a hacking, persistent cough that echoed ominously in the cramped, airless space. The German settlers, who had managed to erect a sod house, faced the ultimate proof that Sand Hill's soil was fundamentally unsuitable for this type of construction. Their walls, built from thin, root-sparse strips of sandy earth, began to collapse under the relentless freeze-thaw cycles. What should have been compressed, solid blocks of earth degraded into loose piles of frozen dirt. During the windstorms, chunks literally fell away from the walls, leaving gaping breaches that no amount of frantic replastering could permanently seal. Firewood was swiftly transforming from a mere commodity into the critical, defining metric for survival. The scattered cottonwoods and willows had been harvested ruthlessly during the settlement's first decade, forcing families to resort to burning everything from dried corn cobs to twisted prairie grass for meager heat. Those who possessed the cash paid ruinous premium prices for rail-shipped coal, but most relied desperately on whatever dead wood they could scavenge from frozen creek beds and abandoned homesteads. Families that had meticulously calculated a 3-cord need to survive the entire winter were burning through their 5th cord by Christmas, with 3 more months of deep cold stretching ahead. Children in conventional houses developed agonizing chilblains on their hands and feet. Mothers wrapped their infants in multiple layers of thick quilts, constantly worried about hypothermia during the coldest hours. The local doctor, making his rounds on horseback, reported more cases of frostbite and cold-related pneumonia than he had seen in 15 years of prairie practice. Several families openly began discussing abandoning their claims entirely and retreating to warmer river towns until spring returned. Meanwhile, the Ole Jensen household presented a stark, undeniable contrast that became literally impossible for the settlement to ignore. Neighbors noted the startling fact that comparatively little smoke rose from Jensen's chimney. While Caldwell's fireplace roared constantly and the school teacher's small stove glowed a desperate, alarming red, Jensen's fire seemed almost ornamental, a modest, steady flame that burned patiently, never urgently. The thick walls absorbed internal heat during the sunlit hours and released it gradually through the frozen night, maintaining exceptionally comfortable temperatures with astonishingly minimal fuel consumption. The compressed grass bales, sealed inside and out with the dense, impervious gumbo mud, created an insulating barrier that defied all conventional construction logic. The secret lay in physics. Each tiny, hollow stem of grass trapped a minute pocket of still air, multiplying the insulating effect thousands of times. The 2-foot-thick walls provided an estimated R value of 50 or potentially higher, utterly crushing the single-digit ratings of the drafty log cabins and thin frame houses. Crucially, the external plaster achieved a truly airtight seal, eliminating the crippling infiltration issues that plagued every other structure. Jensen's children played comfortably indoors, wearing normal street clothes, while neighbor children were bundled into heavy coats and blankets. Jensen's wife was able to bake bread regularly, a small luxury other families had been forced to abandon because their frigid houses were too cold for yeast to rise properly. When the gale-force winds howled across the frozen prairie, the interior of the Jensen home remained eerily silent, the thick walls absorbing the sound as effectively as they retained the heat. The glaring contrast became so potent that several neighbors began concocting transparent excuses to visit, lingering conspicuously in the gentle, pervasive warmth while feigning conversation about crops and cattle. Jensen received them with quiet, Norwegian graciousness, serving hot coffee and discussing farming techniques, but he noted how profoundly reluctant they were to return to their own icy, suffocating homes. The ingrained mockery began to dissipate, transforming into something far closer to raw envy, though few were yet brave enough to admit that their generations of conventional wisdom might be fundamentally incorrect. By early January, temperatures were locked consistently below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, with the coldest nights bottoming out around -15. The wind seemed to possess a demonic, ceaseless energy, driving snow into monumental drifts that buried fences and threatened to engulf single-story buildings. Already, several desperate homesteaders had loaded their families into wagons, abandoning their claims and retreating toward warmer towns rather than risking death in structures incapable of handling the brutal reality. The stage was set, inevitably, for the ultimate test, a trial that would definitively separate solutions based on workable physics from those based purely on stubborn tradition. The morning of January 21, 1899, began with a deceptive, almost eerie calm. The temperature hovered near 0, brutally cold, but manageable for families who had endured the previous month's severity. Children ventured outside cautiously to gather the last of the surface firewood and check on livestock, their breath puffing out in white, crystalline clouds against the still air. By noon, a faint, high sheet of cloud had migrated from the northwest, but it carried no immediate suggestion of the weather catastrophe gathering just beyond the horizon. The first unmistakable warning signal came not from the sky, but from the animals. Around 2 o'clock, every horse and cow in the settlement began exhibiting profound signs of terror. They pawed the frozen ground nervously, jammed themselves against windbreaks, and refused to graze despite the clear skies overhead. The old-timers recognized this deep, instinctual alarm, yet desperately hoped their intuition was wrong. The barometric pressure was plunging faster than any local instrument could register. By 4:30 p.m., the wind arrived. It started without the typical gradual buildup, a steady, unnatural breeze from the northwest that instantaneously intensified into sustained, punishing gusts that made windows rattle violently and sent frozen debris skittering across the hard-packed earth. Within the span of a single hour, the gusts reached 40 miles per hour, driving the finely powdered snow horizontally across the prairie. Visibility collapsed instantly, dropping to less than 50 yards as the tempest swallowed the scattered homesteads. By 6 o'clock, the wind was howling relentlessly at 50 miles per hour, and the air temperature had free-fallen to 10 degrees below 0. Jim Caldwell's conventional log cabin began its losing battle for structural integrity immediately. The ceaseless, immense wind pressure against the north wall systematically exposed every minor flaw in the traditional clay chinking, driving the frigid air through fissures that had seemed negligible during calmer weather. The single-thickness log walls, which settlers had been taught to believe were adequate for Kentucky winters, offered absolutely no buffer against the unrelenting, sustained assault of the plains blizzard. The wood acted less like insulation and more like a thermal conduit, transferring the murderous cold directly into the living space. Snow found every imperfection, filtering through hairline cracks around the window sashes and the ill-fitting doors, quickly forming small, persistent drifts across the interior floors. Caldwell, desperate and frantic, stuffed every available blanket and scrap of cloth against the worst gaps. But the structure itself was compromised. Each temporary repair he made seemed only to reveal two new, more insidious points of entry for the penetrating wind. The large stone fireplace, positioned according to traditional custom against the exposed exterior north wall, quickly became not an asset, but a profound liability. The chimney drew poorly against the fierce headwind howling off the prairie, causing the cabin to fill rapidly with caustic smoke whenever Caldwell attempted to build up the fire above a few meager embers. Far worse, the massive stones of the hearth absorbed the bone-deep cold radiating from the exterior wall and then ruthlessly radiated that stored chill back into the already freezing living space. By midnight, moisture condensing near the hearth had frozen, and ice was visibly forming on the stones themselves, a phenomenon Caldwell had never imagined possible in his home. His family was reduced to a miserable knot, huddled together in the single-room south corner, wrapped in every quilt and blanket they possessed, reduced to frantically burning pieces of their own furniture simply to maintain any level of heat at all. The school teacher's frame house fared even more poorly. The thin plank walls, hastily constructed and lacking proper bracing, flexed visibly and alarmingly under the tremendous wind pressure, creaking and groaning with tortured sounds that resembled a small ship caught in a heavy, unforgiving sea. Snow, driven by the gale, found its way through minute gaps between boards that had seemed perfectly tight and sealed during construction, creating a fine, flour-like powder that accumulated instantly in corners and stubbornly refused to melt, despite the desperate heat emanating from her small, overworked stove. She made a chilling discovery that sealed her sense of defeat. Her water bucket, which she had placed only 3 feet from the firebox, had frozen solid, a terrifying and unambiguous indication that the entire building was rapidly and irreversibly losing the battle against the elements. Meanwhile, the dugout families faced their own unique catastrophe as the storm's fury exceeded even the most pessimistic expectations. The underground structures, which had initially seemed naturally insulated and impervious, proved vulnerable to an entirely different, internal set of problems. Moisture generated by the simple acts of breathing and cooking, trapped within the confined earthen spaces, quickly condensed on the frozen walls and ceiling, forming spreading sheets of slick, internal ice. The Schmidt family awoke in sheer terror at 2 o'clock in the morning to find their youngest daughter unconscious from the severe cold. Her lips were visibly blue, despite the fact that she was sleeping directly between her parents under multiple heavy quilts. They managed, with great effort, to revive her by the fire, but her breathing remained alarmingly shallow and labored, a sound that filled the small space with dread. 3 miles east, the German family's sod house began its final, agonizing collapse around midnight. The sandy soil construction, a poor foundation that had barely held together during milder weather, simply disintegrated under the combined, crushing assault of wind and cold. Chunks of frozen earth fell away from the walls in large, sickening sections, leaving wide, gaping holes that no amount of emergency patching or stuffing could possibly seal. By dawn, they were essentially living outdoors with nothing but a partial, sagging roof overhead, reduced to burning pieces of their furniture in a futile, desperate attempt to create a warming fire within the ruins of their former home. The wind reached its absolute peak intensity around 3 in the morning, maintaining sustained speeds of 55 miles per hour with violent gusts approaching 60. The temperature had plummeted to 22 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, creating a terrifying wind chill factor that could freeze exposed skin and flesh in mere minutes. Snow drifted against buildings with ferocious speed, accumulating faster than the wind could blow it away, creating massive, immovable barriers that added unbearable structural stress to already failing constructions. Meanwhile, inside the Jensen's straw bale house, an entirely different reality existed, a pocket of calm sanity amidst the raging chaos. The 2-foot-thick compressed grass walls, sealed firmly with a plaster made from local gumbo mud, absorbed the full, violent assault of the storm without transmitting any of its destructive effects to the interior space. The remarkable hollow structure of the thousands of grass stems created millions of tiny, sealed air pockets that formed an insulating barrier that no conventional construction technique of the era could possibly match. While neighboring families were desperately burning through their entire winter fuel supplies in a single night of panic, Jensen maintained comfortable, steady temperatures with only modest additions to his central fire every few hours. The immensely thick walls not only retained the precious heat efficiently, but also completely eliminated the infiltration problems, the leaks and drafts, that were actively plaguing every conventional structure in the settlement. The plaster coating, skillfully applied over a wire mesh, had cured into an incredibly durable, airtight shell that the wind simply could not penetrate. Snow that accumulated heavily against the exterior walls actually contributed beneficially to the insulation effect, rather than creating thermal bridges or causing moisture problems. The interior temperature remained remarkably steady at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, while families barely 50 yards away were fighting a losing battle for survival in indoor temperatures hovering dangerously near 20 degrees. Most remarkably, the straw bale construction dampened sound as effectively as it retained heat. While other families listened in terror to their homes creaking, groaning, and audibly threatening to collapse under the storm's fury, the Jensen household experienced an almost eerie, profound calm. The children slept soundly through the worst hours of the blizzard, completely unaware that their neighbors were spending the night convinced they might not survive to see the morning light. At dawn on January 22nd, the first desperate knocking echoed at Jensen's door. Caldwell stood outside, his face etched gray with cold despite the thick scarf wrapped around it, carrying his youngest son, who was wrapped tightly in every blanket they still possessed. The boy's feet had gone completely numb during the night, and Caldwell feared the terrible onset of frostbite. Waiting anxiously behind him stood the school teacher, her lips blue and her hands shaking uncontrollably from the cold and shock. They had finally abandoned their failing shelters and trudged through waist-deep snow drifts to reach the only structure still maintaining truly livable conditions. Jensen opened his door immediately and without hesitation, welcoming them into a warmth that felt like a miraculous gift after the frozen hell they had just endured. More desperate figures were already becoming visible through the blowing snow, slowly but surely making their way toward the straw bale house, the structure that had transformed overnight from a community joke into the community's salvation. By the morning of January 23rd, the storm had finally exhausted its terrible fury, leaving behind a landscape transformed beyond all recognition. Snow drifts reached the very eaves of single-story buildings, and the bitter, relentless wind had sculpted the open prairie into an alien geography of sharp ridges and unnatural valleys. As the sun finally broke through scattered clouds, the true, devastating extent of the catastrophe became shockingly visible across the scattered homesteads of Cherry County. The toll was precise and utterly devastating. Of the 12 families who had attempted to winter in conventional structures within a 5-mile radius of Jensen's homestead, 7 had suffered complete structural failures. Caldwell's log cabin stood technically intact, but was now completely uninhabitable. The constant infiltration of snow and moisture had created a thick, dangerous coating of ice on every interior surface, and the stone fireplace had cracked severely from repeated, violent freeze-thaw cycles. The school teacher's fragile frame house had lost its entire north wall, the thin planks simply blown away and scattered during the peak winds. 3 dugout families had been forced to abandon their underground shelters when the internal ice formation made proper breathing dangerous and heating utterly impossible. Most tragic was the German family whose sod house had disintegrated entirely. They had spent the storm's worst hours huddled miserably under an old wagon in the ruins of their former home, desperately burning pieces of their furniture and clothing in a futile attempt to maintain a small fire. The father had suffered severe frostbite on both hands, and their 6-year-old daughter was showing early, alarming signs of pneumonia from prolonged exposure to the sub-zero temperatures. Only the immediate intervention of neighbors who carried them through the massive drifts to Jensen's house had prevented what would certainly have been the settlement's first weather-related deaths. The Schmidt family emerged from their dugout to discover that the moisture from their collective breathing had created a solid, thick shell of ice across the entire interior walls. The underground space that had promised natural insulation had instead become a tomb of frozen earth that radiated cold far more effectively than it retained any heat. Their youngest child had survived the night only because the parents had meticulously shared their body heat under every blanket they owned, taking painful turns staying awake to continually maintain the fire that kept hypothermia at bay. In stark, glorious contrast, the Jensen family had slept soundly and peacefully through the entire ordeal. The straw bale house maintained stable interior temperatures of 65 degrees throughout the storm with minimal fuel consumption, perhaps 1/10 the amount of wood that neighboring families had frantically burned while fighting for their very survival. The thick walls showed absolutely no signs of stress or infiltration, and the interior remained perfectly dry despite the blizzard's incredible moisture. Most remarkably, Jensen calculated later that he had used less firewood during the entire 3-day crisis than Caldwell typically burned in a single, normal winter day. Word of the dramatic survival differences spread through the snowbound community faster than anyone could physically travel the buried roads. Families who had openly ridiculed the haystack house now found themselves utterly dependent on its warmth and structural integrity for their lives. The Jensen home quickly transformed into an impromptu, bustling refugee center, sheltering 14 people at its peak capacity, 7 adults and 7 children from 5 different families. The structure that skeptics had previously dismissed as a temporary curiosity proved spacious enough to accommodate them all comfortably and safely, while conventional homes lay in frozen ruins all around it. Jensen opened his home without reservation, sharing not only the miraculous warmth, but also his food stores and, crucially, the practical knowledge that had saved them. As the neighboring families slowly recovered from their ordeal, they began asking detailed, urgent questions about the construction techniques they had previously dismissed as foolish novelty. How did he achieve such genuinely airtight walls? What exactly prevented the straw from rotting or attracting destructive rodents? How much did the materials truly cost compared to conventional building supplies? Jensen answered each question patiently and thoroughly, demonstrating the fundamental principles that had literally saved their lives. The technical explanations revealed the elegant, robust science behind what appeared to be simple construction. Each highly compressed straw bale contained millions of hollow grass stems, creating countless air spaces that effectively trapped still air and prevented heat transfer through conduction, the fatal flaw in log and frame houses. When compressed to 90 pounds per bale and expertly stacked in a running bond pattern, these natural tubes formed an insulating barrier with an estimated R value exceeding 10 times the insulating capacity of single-wall log construction. The gumbo mud plaster, carefully mixed with local clay and chopped straw, dried into an airtight, rock-hard seal that completely eliminated the severe infiltration problems that had doomed conventional structures. Equally important was the inherent thermal mass effect of the thick walls. During sunny winter days, the massive bales absorbed heat and stored it efficiently within their compressed organic material, then released this stored warmth gradually and steadily through the long, frigid night. This natural heating system drastically reduced fuel requirements while maintaining stable, steady temperatures that prevented the destructive freeze-thaw cycles fatal to both buildings and human health. The strategic positioning of Jensen's fireplace in the center of the structure rather than against an exterior wall maximized heat retention and eliminated the cold radiation that had made Caldwell's exterior stone chimney a fatal liability rather than an asset. Reverend Samuel Weaver, who had weathered the storm safely in town, arrived 3 days after the blizzard to find his scattered congregation gathered securely in the straw bale house. His validation carried significant weight and authority in the community. Here was an educated man who had traveled widely and seen various survival techniques used across the entire frontier. "This is precisely what I observed among the Mandan people along the Missouri River," he told the assembled families. They used earth lodges that employed these very same principles of thick insulation and central heating. It is indigenous knowledge adapted brilliantly to available materials. By February, even before the last of the snow had fully melted, 3 families began making concrete plans to build straw bale homes before the onset of the next winter. The Schmidt family, whose failed dugout had nearly killed their youngest child, started gathering prairie grass bundles as soon as the land became accessible. They had seen firsthand that survival depended not on following rigid tradition, but on adopting techniques that demonstrably worked in the specific local conditions of the Nebraska sandhills. Caldwell, his pride deeply wounded but his family miraculously alive, began quietly inquiring about baling equipment and the specific construction details. The school teacher, whose frame house was a total structural loss, announced her firm intention to rebuild using straw bale construction. She had spent 4 nights in Jensen's home during the storm's aftermath and had experienced the profound, life-saving difference that proper insulation made in daily comfort, health, and fuel efficiency. Her decision carried particular social significance because teachers were expected to demonstrate conventional respectability. Her adoption of the technique forcefully signaled broader community acceptance. Jensen found himself transformed overnight from the community eccentric to the indispensable local expert. Neighbors who had openly mocked his methods now anxiously sought his advice on everything from optimal bale compression techniques to the best plaster recipes. He shared his knowledge freely and comprehensively, explaining precisely how to notch bales for door and window frames, how to secure the walls using sharpened wooden pins, and how to achieve the proper, durable mixture of clay, sand, and chopped straw for the exterior plastering. The survival and future of his neighbors depended on the same fundamental principles that had saved his own family, and he understood deeply that community resilience required shared knowledge rather than individual secrets. Spring arrived late in 1899, but by May the surviving families had begun the hard, practical work of rebuilding their lives around the crucial lessons learned in January's crucible. Jensen returned to his normal routines, tending crops, repairing equipment, and caring for livestock, but the quiet, persistent requests for construction advice continued steadily throughout the entire growing season. He never mentioned the storm, nor did he ever gloat about his complete vindication. When neighbors asked about wall thickness or bale spacing, he answered with the same patient precision he brought to discussing seed varieties or irrigation techniques. The first disciples began construction that summer. The Schmidt family, haunted by their near-death experience in the failed dugout, built their straw bale house methodically and carefully under Jensen's constant guidance. They learned to compress bales to precisely 90 pounds for optimal density, stack them meticulously in a running bond pattern with joints staggered 18 inches, and secure each course firmly with sharpened wooden pins driven through multiple layers. Their finished walls rose to 22 inches thick, slightly thinner than Jensen's original design, but still providing an impressive R value of 45, which was more than adequate for prairie conditions. The school teacher's replacement structure incorporated subtle refinements learned from the January disaster. She positioned her fireplace centrally rather than against an exterior wall, immediately eliminating the cold radiation that had made her frame house uninhabitable. Her bale walls included sturdy wire mesh reinforcement before plastering, creating an even more durable, crack-resistant shell than the original simple gumbo mud technique. The finished building looked perfectly conventional from a distance, white plastered walls and standard roofing, but provided a level of comfort and fuel efficiency that amazed visiting school officials. By 1900, 7 straw bale structures had been successfully completed in Cherry County, ranging from family homes to a small church that served 3 rural congregations. Each builder adapted the basic technique to local needs and readily available materials, creating variations that proved the method's flexibility. Some used lime-based stucco instead of clay plaster. Others experimented with different bale dimensions, but all achieved the fundamental, shared goal of creating thick, insulating walls from the abundant prairie grass. The technique spread quietly through informal, practical networks of neighbors helping neighbors. When families moved on to new homesteads, They carried this construction knowledge along with their household goods. A family that relocated from Cherry County to Holt County built Nebraska's first two-story straw bale house in 1902, proving definitively that the method could support significant structural loads. Ranchers discovered that straw bale barns maintained comfortable temperatures for livestock while requiring minimal heating, making winter feeding operations far more efficient and less costly. Documentation of this building boom reveals the impressive scope of adoption across the Sandhills region. County records and homestead applications show that between 1896 and 1945, at least 70 distinct straw bale structures were built in the region: houses, barns, schools, churches, and even a small store in the town of Arthur. Most used variations of Jensen's original technique, with walls typically ranging from 18 to 24 inches thick and R values consistently exceeding conventional construction standards by factors of 5 to 10. The most remarkable testament to the method's enduring durability stands today in the form of the Pilgrim Holiness Church, constructed in 1928 near Arthur, Nebraska. Built with walls of compressed rice straw bales nearly 2 feet thick, the structure has survived 9 decades of violent prairie weather with minimal required maintenance. The National Register of Historic Places officially recognized the building in 1986, noting that its straw bale construction represents a significant and pioneering example of vernacular architecture intelligently adapted to local environmental conditions and available materials. Other structures from the early period demonstrated similar, extraordinary longevity. The Fulner House, built in 1903 using Jensen's exact specifications, remained occupied continuously until 1978, when the family finally sold the homestead. New owners reported that interior temperatures stayed comfortable year-round with minimal heating and cooling costs. The Martin Barn, constructed in 1908, housed cattle through 70 harsh winters before finally being demolished in 1978, not because of structural failure, but simply because modern farming operations required substantially larger facilities. The technique's quiet, persistent success eventually attracted the critical attention of agricultural extension agents and university researchers during the 1930s. A detailed study conducted by the Nebraska Agricultural Experiment Station. The documented performance data was unequivocal, detailing fuel savings ranging from 60 to 70% when compared against standard light frame construction. Beyond mere cost reduction, the reports highlighted the superior interior climate control, providing deep, consistent comfort during both the stifling summer heat waves and the biting severity of winter cold. Crucially, the studies established that the thick straw bale walls inherently regulated interior moisture content, acting as a hygroscopic buffer that actively prevented the damaging condensation issues that routinely plagued traditional sod dugouts and poorly insulated buildings imported from forested regions. This promising trajectory of natural building techniques, however, was temporarily sidelined by the demands of global conflict. World War II necessitated a total mobilization, shifting essential materials, labor, and capital away from residential construction and towards war production, effectively ending the straw bale movement for a generation. Yet, necessity and renewed consciousness often drive innovation, and the technique experienced a profound and unexpected renaissance in the latter half of the 20th century. The environmental movement, coupled with global energy crises and a surging demand for energy efficiency, catalyzed a renewed interest in what contemporary researchers began to label as natural building methods. The very principles of resourcefulness and thermal stability that had preserved lives during the catastrophic winter of 1899, a testament to adaptive ingenuity, once again appealed strongly to modern homeowners struggling with escalating energy costs and actively seeking sustainable, low-impact alternatives to conventional, resource-intensive construction. As the movement gained traction, modern regulatory bodies were compelled to recognize its viability. Building codes began formally incorporating straw bale construction during the 1980s and 1990s, diligently establishing engineering standards, rigorous inspection protocols, and load calculations specifically designed for load-bearing bale walls. States facing extreme climates and unique geographical constraints notably Nebraska, Colorado, and New Mexico, took the lead, developing specific regulations governing these buildings and officially acknowledging both their exceptional energy efficiency and their verifiable structural viability. Today's contemporary builders discovered that they could optimize performance even further by seamlessly combining time-honored traditional techniques with advanced modern materials, employing robust cement-based stucco finishes, integrated moisture barriers, and engineered foundation systems designed to extend the building's functional life almost indefinitely. Jensen, the quiet architect of this revolution, lived long enough to witness his community's complete and comprehensive transformation from initial, biting skepticism to widespread, confident adoption. Characteristically, he remained profoundly modest about his pivotal role in driving this monumental change, viewing his actions not as genius, but as simple common sense. When a newspaper reporter sought him out in 1925 to document the story of the prairie pioneer, Jensen deflected the praise. He attributed his lasting success solely to the sturdy, pragmatic Norwegian building traditions he had inherited and the application of straightforward common sense, rejecting the notion of any special, proprietary innovation. "The prairie grass was here all along," he observed, his gaze sweeping across the vast expanse of rippling fields. People simply needed to recognize it as viable building material instead of merely livestock feed. The broader, profound lesson unearthed by Jensen's simple solution extended far beyond the realm of construction techniques. When rigid conventional wisdom inevitably collided with the stark, unforgiving reality of the environment, true survival belonged to those nimble enough to adapt their methods, rather than those who stubbornly insisted on upholding outdated tradition. The enduring warmth that enveloped the Jensen family during those dreadful winter nights came not from superior, costly imported materials or advanced, unattainable technology, but from the simple, profound act of recognizing that local resources, when properly understood and applied, could decisively outperform complex, expensive imported solutions designed for entirely different climates and conditions. In a landscape defined by tree scarcity and brutal, unrelenting winters, the compressed, tightly bound prairie grass proved immediately more practical than hauling distant logs, vastly more durable than unstable sod, and immeasurably more economical than relying on expensive shipped lumber. The initial, harsh mockery that had greeted his humble haystack house had ultimately transformed into a quiet, respectful adoption, a principle that saved lives, established a resilient and enduring building tradition, and survived for well over a century.